The Godfather is considered by many to be the greatest crime film ever made. The quiet power of Don Vito Corleone, the transformation of Michael, the restaurant shooting, the barbershop chair, the bullet through Mo Green's eye. Every scene feels so real that people have spent over 50 years asking the same question. Did this actually happen? Could any of this be true? The answer is yes, and the truth is worse than anything Francis Ford Coppola ever put on screen. The real men behind the Corleone family did not hold back the way the movie did. They did not stop the camera before the worst part. They did not soften the ending for the audience. The real hits were colder. The betrayals were deeper. The blood ran further than any film would ever be allowed to show. Today we are covering 10 real-life mafia killings that directly inspired The Godfather, and why the truth hits harder than the fiction ever could. Section 1. The Restaurant Hit. On a warm Wednesday afternoon in the spring of 1931, a heavy-set man in a dark suit walked into a small seafood restaurant in Coney Island, Brooklyn. His name was Giuseppe Masseria, though everyone in the New York underworld called him Joe the Boss. He was 45 years old. He was the most powerful Italian crime figure in America at that moment. He controlled nearly every major racket in New York City, and he had about 3 hours left to live. The restaurant was called Nuova Villa Tamaro. It sat at 2715 West 15th Street, a few blocks from the beach. The owner was a man named Gerardo Scarpato. Masseria had eaten there many times. He trusted the place. He trusted the neighborhood. Most of all, he trusted the man who had invited him to lunch that day, a young lieutenant from his own organization named Charles Luciano. Everyone called him Lucky. What Masseria did not know was that Lucky Luciano had been secretly meeting with the enemy for months. For over a year, Masseria had been fighting a brutal street war against a rival faction led by a Sicilian boss named Salvatore Maranzano. The war had a name. It was called the Castellano War, and by the spring of 1931, it had left around 60 dead gangsters scattered across New York. Masseria was losing. His own men were starting to defect. His own lieutenants were starting to whisper. And Luciano had decided the war was bad for business. So Luciano made a deal. He went to Maranzano in secret and offered him a trade. Luciano would hand over his own boss. In exchange, Maranzano would end the war and let Luciano take over Masseria's operation. That was the plan that brought Joe the Boss to Coney Island on April 15, 1931. Masseria arrived at the restaurant in an armored car with 2 bodyguards. He was led to a table in the back room. Luciano was already there. They sat down together and ordered a light meal: bread, wine, coffee, no heavy food. After they finished eating, the 2 men pulled out a deck of cards and started playing a round of pinochle. The restaurant was quiet. Scarpato, the owner, told his mother-in-law to stay in the kitchen, and then quietly stepped outside, saying he was going for a walk. He never came back during the shooting. At around 3 in the afternoon, Luciano put down his cards and excused himself to go to the bathroom. That was the signal. 4 men walked into the dining room. According to mob historians and the later testimony of informants, the 4 were Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and a young enforcer named Benjamin Siegel, who was better known by the nickname Bugsy. All 4 would go on to become legendary figures in organized crime. On that afternoon, they were a hit team with one job. They opened fire on Masseria from behind. More than 20 shots were fired from .32 and .38 caliber pistols. 4 rounds hit Masseria in the back. 1 hit him in the head. His body slumped forward onto the table and then slid to the floor. The 4 gunmen walked back out of the restaurant and climbed into a waiting car.
The story goes that a mobster named Ciro Terranova, nicknamed the Artichoke King, was supposed to drive the getaway vehicle. But Terranova was so shaken by what had just happened that his hands were trembling on the wheel. According to mob legend, Bugsy Siegel shoved him out of the driver's seat and took over. The car sped off. The killers left behind a stolen vehicle, several handguns, and their hats and overcoats. When Luciano came out of the bathroom, he acted surprised. He told the police he had been washing his hands and heard nothing. He said he did not know who could have done such a thing. Not a single witness came forward. The case was never officially solved. When the press arrived, a photographer took one of the most famous crime scene photographs in American history. Masseria was lying on the floor of the restaurant. His right hand was curled around a single playing card, the ace of spades. For decades, this image would define the idea of a mob hit in the public imagination. Most historians now believe the card was placed in Masseria's hand by a reporter who wanted a more dramatic photograph. The men had been playing pinochle, not poker. But the image stuck. The ace of spades became a symbol of gangland death. The moment Joe the Boss died, the shape of American organized crime changed forever. With Masseria gone, the Castellano War was over. Luciano stepped into his boss's empire and became the right hand of Salvatore Maranzano. Within 5 months, Luciano would betray Maranzano too. But that is a different story. The Masseria hit matters for another reason. It became the blueprint for one of the most famous scenes in film history. 41 years later, Francis Ford Coppola would direct a moment in The Godfather, where Michael Corleone sits down for a meal with 2 men he plans to kill. He excuses himself partway through. He walks toward the bathroom. He comes back with a weapon and opens fire. The restaurant's setting, the false calm of the meal, the moment of stepping away, the explosion of violence at close range, all of it is pulled from what happened inside Nuova Villa Tammaro on April 15, 1931. The difference is that the film softened it. In the movie, Michael Corleone is a reluctant young man being pulled into a world he never wanted. In real life, Lucky Luciano was already deep inside that world. And the man he was betraying was not a corrupt police captain. It was his own boss, the man who had trained him, the man who trusted him enough to turn his back and play cards. But Luciano was not finished. He had only removed one of the 2 old-world bosses standing in his way. There was still a man who called himself the boss of all bosses. And that man was about to find out that the same lieutenant who had just handed him a victory was already planning his funeral. Section 2. The Office Coup. Salvatore Maranzano. September 10, 1931. 5 months after Joe Masseria was taken out in that Coney Island restaurant, a man named Salvatore Maranzano was sitting at the top of the American underworld. He had won the war. He had crushed his rival. And he had given himself a brand new title that no one had ever held before in the United States. He called himself the Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. Maranzano was 45 years old. He had been born in a small town in Sicily called Castellamare del Golfo. As a young man, he had actually studied to become a Catholic priest. He spoke several languages. He read books about ancient Rome. He was obsessed with Julius Caesar, and he liked to compare himself to the emperors of the old Roman Empire. His men even gave him a nickname because of this obsession. They called him Little Caesar. In the summer of 1931, Maranzano called a massive meeting of mob leaders from across the country. Hundreds of gangsters gathered to hear him speak. He stood up and laid out a new system for organized crime in America. He divided the New York underworld into 5 separate crime groups, each with its own boss, underboss, captains, and soldiers. That structure still exists today. It is the system every mob movie you have ever seen is based on.
This was the moment it was born. Maranzano built it. There was just one problem. Maranzano was not the only young, ambitious man in that room, and Lucky Luciano had been watching him the entire time. Luciano had helped Maranzano win the war by betraying Joe Masseria. In return,
Maranzano had promised Luciano a seat at the top of the table. But the deal started to go sour almost immediately. Maranzano was greedy. He started taking rackets away from the other families and giving them to himself. He started acting like a king rather than a leader. Luciano thought the whole idea of a boss of all bosses was a bad one. He believed it created too much jealousy and too much violence. He wanted a council system where the families were equals and disputes were settled by a vote. Luciano had also learned something else. A man named Tommy Lucchese, who worked inside Maranzano's organization but was secretly loyal to Luciano, had slipped him a warning. Maranzano had drawn up a list of people he wanted eliminated. The list reportedly included Luciano, Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, Al Capone in Chicago, and several others. Maranzano had already hired an Irish gunman named Vincent Call, nicknamed Mad Dog, to handle the job. Maranzano had paid Call a down payment of $25,000, with another $25,000 promised once the work was done. The plan was simple. Maranzano would call Luciano and Genovese to his office for a meeting. Mad Dog Call would be waiting to take them out as soon as they walked in. Luciano found out about the plan before it could happen, and he decided to move first. Maranzano's headquarters was on the 9th floor of the New York Central Building at 230 Park Avenue in Manhattan. The building still stands today. It is now called the Helmsley Building. On the afternoon of September 10, 1931, Maranzano was in his office when his secretary told him that 4 men had arrived. They had flashed official-looking badges and said they were federal tax agents. They said they needed to speak to Mr. Maranzano about a financial matter. Maranzano told her to let them wait. He was not worried. Tax agents showed up at mob offices all the time back then. The 4 men were not tax agents. They were killers. Luciano had made a careful choice about who to send. He knew Maranzano would recognize any Italian gunman on sight. His own bodyguards would spot a face and raise the alarm. So Luciano borrowed a team of Jewish gangsters from his longtime friends Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. Maranzano had never met any of them. He had no idea what they looked like. The names most often connected to the hit team are Samuel Red Levine and Bo Weinberg. Tommy Lucchese, the double agent inside Maranzano's own organization, was also in the office that day. His job was to identify the target so the killers did not hit the wrong man. The moment the 4 men got past the secretary, they pulled out their weapons and took control of the room. They lined Maranzano's bodyguards against the wall and stripped them of their guns. Then 2 of them walked into Maranzano's private office. What happened next was fast and brutal. The killers stabbed Maranzano several times. Then they shot him. By the time it was over, the man who had called himself the boss of all bosses was dead on the floor of his own office, after barely 5 months on his self-made throne. The killers ran out through the waiting room, down the stairwell, and into the street. On their way out, according to mob legend, they ran into Mad Dog Call, who was arriving for his own appointment to take out Luciano. One of the killers supposedly told Call the job was off and to go home. Call kept the $25,000 down payment and walked away. The murder case was never officially solved. Witnesses saw nothing. Evidence was thin, but the effect was immediate. With Maranzano gone, Luciano abolished the title of Boss of All Bosses forever. He set up a governing council called the Commission. Every major family got a seat. Disputes would be settled by vote, not by shotgun.
That system is the same one referenced in the final meeting of the heads of the 5 families in The Godfather. The film shows it as a formal, almost dignified gathering of powerful men around a table. In real life, the commission was born from a pile of dead bodies.
Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The commission would hold power for decades. It would decide life and death for hundreds of men. And one of the first major decisions it would ever make would change the face of Las Vegas forever by taking out the man who had invented it. Section 3. The Bugsy Siegel murder equals the Moe Greene killing. June 20th, 1947. If you have watched The Godfather, you remember the character of Moe Greene. He is the loud, confident casino owner who built a gambling empire in the Nevada desert. He gets into a heated argument with Michael Corleone about the future of Las Vegas. And then, in one of the most famous death scenes in film history, Moe Greene is sitting on a massage table getting a rubdown when a single bullet comes through his eye from close range. He falls back, dead, and the camera lingers on the image of his ruined glasses. Moe Greene was not invented. Mario Puzo and Francis Ford Coppola based him almost entirely on one real man. His name was Benjamin Siegel, but the whole world knew him as Bugsy. And the way he died in 1947 is the reason that death scene exists. Bugsy Siegel was born in Brooklyn in 1906. He grew up poor, the son of Jewish immigrants from the Russian Empire. By the time he was a teenager, he was running a small extortion racket on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, collecting protection money from street vendors. It was during those years that he met a quiet, calculating young man named Meyer Lansky. The two of them became partners for life. Together, they built a small crew of Jewish gunmen that later became part of a larger operation called Murder Incorporated. Siegel was one of the most feared enforcers in the country. He was one of the 4 shooters inside the Coney Island restaurant the day Joe Masseria was taken out. He was part of the team Lansky provided when Salvatore Maranzano was handled in his office. Siegel was at nearly every major turning point in the creation of the modern American Mafia. In 1937, Siegel was sent to California. The mob wanted someone in Los Angeles to run their West Coast gambling, bookmaking, and narcotics operations. Siegel was a handsome, charming, flashy man who loved the spotlight, and Hollywood suited him. He moved into a mansion in Beverly Hills. He became friends with some of the biggest movie stars of the era, including Clark Gable, Cary Grant, and Jean Harlow. He threw all-night parties. He carried himself like a celebrity. But his biggest idea was still ahead of him. In 1945, Siegel started paying attention to a sleepy desert town in Nevada called Las Vegas. Gambling was already legal there, but there was not much else. Siegel decided to build the first truly luxurious hotel and casino on the strip of highway that ran through the desert on the road from Los Angeles. He called it the Flamingo. The budget was supposed to be around $1 million. By the time construction was finished, it had blown past $6 million. Most of that money came from his partners in the New York and Chicago underworld. The Flamingo opened on December 26, 1946. The weather was terrible. Famous guests canceled. The tables lost money. The hotel had to close within weeks to finish construction. When it reopened in March 1947, it finally started turning a profit. But it was too late. Siegel's partners had lost patience. They believed Siegel and his girlfriend, a courier named Virginia Hill, had been stealing from the construction budget. Estimates suggested around $1 million had gone missing. That was a fortune in 1947. A meeting of top mob leaders, including Lucky Luciano himself, had already taken place in Havana, Cuba in late 1946. According to later accounts from informants, a decision was reached at that meeting. Bugsy Siegel had to go. Meyer Lansky, his closest friend in the world, reportedly agreed. Reluctantly, but he agreed.
On the night of June 20th, 1947, Siegel was sitting on a flower-patterned couch in the living room of a mansion at 810 North Linden Drive in Beverly Hills. The house did not belong to him. He had leased it for Virginia Hill, who was not there that night. She had left for Paris after an argument with him a few days earlier. Siegel had flown in from Las Vegas to pick up some personal items and was waiting for his daughters to arrive by train from New York for a visit. He was 41 years old. He was reading a copy of the Los Angeles Times.
A business associate named Alan Smiley was sitting on the couch next to him. Virginia Hill's brother, her brother's girlfriend, and the household cook were also somewhere in the house. Just before 11 at night, a gunman stepped up to a trellis in the driveway on the side of the house. He rested the barrel of an M1 carbine on the wooden lattice, just 14 feet from the living room window. He fired 9 shots through the glass. 4 of the rounds hit Siegel. The bullets struck his head and upper body with such force that one of them knocked his eyeball clean out of its socket. The eye was later found several feet away from the couch. Alan Smiley, sitting right next to him, had his jacket ripped by a passing bullet, but was otherwise unharmed. Siegel died instantly. He never saw the shooter. No one was ever arrested. The case remains officially open to this day. But the coordination of the hit was obvious. At almost the exact moment Siegel was shot in Beverly Hills, 3 of Meyer Lansky's associates walked into the lobby of the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas and announced that they were now running the place. The Flamingo had a new owner before Bugsy's body had cooled. When Coppola put Mo Green on screen in 1972, he gave the character Siegel's confidence, his flash, his Jewish heritage, and his role as the man who built Vegas. Then he gave him the same death, a bullet through the eye in a moment of relaxation from a killer he never saw coming. That hit closed the door on one era of the American underworld. But a new generation of bosses was about to rise in New York, and within 10 years, one of them would survive a shooting that became the single most important moment in the entire Godfather story. Section 4. The Barbershop Execution. Albert Anastasia, October 25, 1957. On the morning of October 25, 1957, a large man in an expensive suit walked into the barbershop of the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. The hotel was located at the corner of 56th Street and 7th Avenue, right in the heart of the busiest part of the city. The barbershop inside the hotel was one of the most exclusive grooming spots in New York. Politicians went there, businessmen went there, celebrities went there. And on that particular Friday morning, so did one of the most feared men in the history of organized crime. His name was Albert Anastasia. He was 55 years old, and he had about 15 minutes to live. Anastasia had been born in a small town in Calabria, Italy in 1902. He arrived in the United States as a young man and quickly fell in with the Brooklyn dockworkers and the small-time criminals who ran the waterfront. By the 1930s, he was one of the top enforcers in the American Mafia. He had been one of the 4 shooters inside the Coney Island restaurant the day Joe Massacre was handled. He had climbed the ladder fast. By the 1940s, he was running a special unit of the underworld that the newspapers nicknamed Murder Incorporated. It was essentially a team of professional hitmen who took on contract work for all the major crime families. Law enforcement officials estimate Murder Incorporated was responsible for somewhere between 400 and 700 killings during its peak years. Anastasia was the man giving the orders. The press gave him 2 nicknames. One was the Mad Hatter, the other was the Lord High Executioner. In 1951, Anastasia became the official boss of what would later be known as the Gambino crime family. He was at the top of the mountain. But by 1957, he had made too many enemies, and one of those enemies was his own underboss, a quiet and patient man named Carlo Gambino.
Carlo Gambino had been watching Anastasia for a long time. He thought Anastasia was reckless. He thought Anastasia was bringing too much attention to the family. He thought Anastasia had to go. So Gambino reached out to Vito Genovese, another ambitious boss from a rival family,
and the two of them quietly agreed to get rid of Anastasia together. Once he was gone, Gambino would take over the family, and Genovese would declare himself the dominant power in New York. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Anastasia arrived at the Park Sheraton Hotel with his bodyguard, a man named Anthony Coppola. Coppola parked Anastasia's car in the underground garage. Then he walked away. He said he was going for a stroll. Anastasia was left completely unprotected. Whether Coppola had been paid off or simply ordered to stand down has never been officially confirmed, but his absence that morning was not an accident. Anastasia walked into the shop and sat down in the fourth chair. His barber was a man named Joseph Bocchino. Bocchino wrapped Anastasia's face in a hot towel, a standard part of a traditional shave, and began to prepare his tools. Anastasia closed his eyes and relaxed. A few moments later, two men walked into the barber shop. They were wearing scarves over their faces. They had gloves on their hands. Without saying a word, they shoved the barber out of the way and opened fire on the man in the fourth chair. The first volley of shots did not bring Anastasia down immediately. According to witnesses and police reports, he somehow managed to get up out of the chair. With the hot towel still on his face and bullets flying, he lunged forward. But because of the layout of the shop, he was actually lunging at the reflection of his attackers in the large mirror on the wall in front of him. He crashed into the mirror before he finally collapsed onto the tile floor. The killers continued firing until he stopped moving, and then they turned and walked out of the hotel. One of the handguns used in the killing was later recovered from a trash basket on the street right outside. There were 14 witnesses inside the barbershop that morning. More than 100 detectives were eventually assigned to the case. No one was ever charged. No one was ever convicted. The murder of Albert Anastasia remains officially unsolved to this day. Over the years, several names have surfaced as the likely shooters. The most credible information, which came out decades later from a former Gambino captain named Michael DiLeonardo, identified the gunmen as Stephen Armone and Stephen Gramata, along with a third man whose name was never confirmed. What is certain is that the hit was ordered at the top. Carlo Gambino became the new boss of the family less than a month later. The family was renamed after him. It is still called the Gambino family today. The image of Anastasia lying dead on the barbershop floor, wrapped in white towels and surrounded by blood, became one of the most published crime scene photographs in American history. It ran in newspapers across the country. It ran in magazines around the world. It defined the idea of a public mob execution for an entire generation. After the killing, the owner of the barbershop repositioned all the chairs so they no longer faced the mirror. The chair Anastasia had been sitting in was later sold at auction for $7,000. Today, it sits in a display case at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. The barbershop itself is long gone. The space where it used to be is now a Starbucks. The Godfather never recreated this scene directly, but its influence is everywhere in the film. The idea of a powerful man being taken out in a public place during a routine moment, completely unprotected because the people around him are in on it, runs through nearly every major death in the trilogy. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Less than 6 months before Anastasia sat in that barber chair, another famous mob figure had been walking into his apartment building in Manhattan when a gunman stepped out of the shadows and fired at the back of his head. That shooting missed by an inch, and it became the single most important real-life event behind the entire plot of The Godfather. Section 5. The Costello attempted hit equals the Vito Corleone shooting, May 2, 1957.
If you have ever wondered where The Godfather actually came from, this is the scene. Not a scene from the movie, an actual real-life moment that Mario Puzo took and placed at the emotional center of his novel. Everything that happens in The Godfather after Don Vito Corleone gets shot in the street, every twist, every war between the families, every decision Michael Corleone makes to protect his father, all of it traces back to one night in Manhattan in the spring of 1957.
The man at the center of it was named Frank Costello. He was 66 years old. He was one of the most powerful men in New York without a single official job title. The newspapers called him the Prime Minister of the Underworld. He was the acting boss of what was then called the Luciano crime family, the organization that Lucky Luciano had built after taking out Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano back in 1931. Luciano had been deported to Italy years earlier, so Costello was running things on his behalf. Costello was not like most mob bosses. He hated violence. He preferred to solve problems with money, with favors, and with political connections. He knew judges, he knew senators, he knew the people who ran New York City. He wore tailored suits and drank at elegant restaurants and carried himself more like a businessman than a gangster. When Marlon Brando was preparing to play Don Vito Corleone in The Godfather, he specifically studied tapes of Frank Costello giving testimony at a Senate hearing in the 1950s. Brando copied Costello's voice. He copied Costello's calm manner. He copied the way Costello kept his hands folded when he spoke. Most of what you see when you watch Marlon Brando play The Godfather is Brando doing an imitation of Frank Costello. But not everyone inside Costello's own organization was happy with the way he ran things. A rival named Vito Genovese had been plotting against him for years. Genovese was the exact opposite of Costello. He was impatient, he was violent, and he wanted to be the boss. By 1957, Genovese had decided to stop waiting. He was going to take Costello out. The job was given to a young enforcer named Vincent Gigante. Everyone called him the Chin. He was a former professional boxer who had fought in 25 matches before turning full-time to the mob. He was tall, heavy, and strong. Genovese gave him a simple order: kill Frank Costello. On the evening of May 2nd, 1957, Frank Costello went out to dinner with his wife and a few friends at a restaurant called Monsignor on East 55th Street. He was planning to stay out later, but something came up and he had to return home to take a phone call. He took a cab back to his apartment building, a beautiful pre-war building called the Majestic. Located at 115 Central Park West, just across from Central Park. He lived on the 18th floor. As Costello's cab pulled up to the front of the building, a long black Cadillac slowly pulled in behind it. Costello did not notice. He stepped out of the cab, walked up to the entrance, and headed into the lobby. A massive figure stepped out of the Cadillac. It was Vincent Gigante. At the time, he weighed close to 300 pounds. He rushed into the lobby behind Costello and hid for a moment behind a marble pillar. Then, he pulled out a revolver. As Costello walked toward the elevators, Gigante stepped out from behind the pillar and called out to him. He shouted something along the lines of, "This is for you, Frank." Costello turned his head at the sound of his own name, and that single motion saved his life. Because Costello turned just as Gigante pulled the trigger, the bullet did not hit him straight in the head the way it was supposed to. Instead, it grazed the side of his scalp, traveling around the inside of his hat. It was a flesh wound. Costello staggered forward, collapsed onto a leather couch in the lobby, and held his head while blood ran down his face. Gigante, thinking the job was done, ran back out of the building, jumped into the Cadillac, and the car sped away into the streets of Manhattan. The bullet never penetrated Costello's skull. He was taken to a hospital, treated, and released within hours. What happened next is the reason this moment is so important. The doorman of the Majestic had gotten a clear look at Gigante, and the police were able to identify him within weeks. Gigante was arrested and charged with attempted murder. But when the case went to trial in May 1958, Frank Costello took the stand and told the jury he had never seen the shooter's face. He refused to point the finger. He obeyed the mob code of silence, which is called omerta. Without Costello's identification, the prosecution had no case. Gigante was acquitted. According to reporters who were in the courtroom that day, Gigante walked over to Costello on his way out and whispered 2 words to him. "Thanks, Frank." Costello took the hint. He knew the next bullet would not miss. Within months, he announced his retirement from the rackets. He handed control of the family over to Vito Genovese, which is why that organization is called the Genovese crime family to this day. Now look at the Godfather. Don Vito Corleone is an aging mob boss who refuses to change with the times. A rival pushes him to get involved in the drug trade. He says no. A shooter is sent to take him out in public, in broad daylight. The first shots miss the fatal target. Vito survives. He steps back from power. His enemies celebrate. His family goes to war. Every single beat of that story comes from Frank Costello stepping into the lobby of the Majestic on May 2nd, 1957. While Costello survived his shooting and quietly walked away, the Mafia's next act of public violence would not be quiet at all. It would be loud, it would be public, and it would leave 7 men dead on a garage floor in Chicago, in a killing so brutal it would define an entire decade.
Section 6. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. February 14th, 1929. To understand how bad things got in Chicago during the late 1920s, you need to understand what was happening in America at the time. In 1920, the United States government had banned the sale, production, and transport of alcohol. This 13-year period was called Prohibition. The idea was to clean up the country and reduce crime. What actually happened was the exact opposite. Alcohol did not disappear, it simply moved underground. And whoever controlled the underground supply stood to make an enormous amount of money. Nobody understood this better than a man named Alphonse Capone. The world knew him as Al. He was 29 years old by 1929. He ran an organization called the Chicago Outfit, and he controlled most of the south side of the city. His organization smuggled whiskey from Canada, brewed beer in secret warehouses, and ran hundreds of illegal bars called speakeasies. His yearly income in 1929 was estimated to be over $40 million. That is more than $700 million in today's money. But Capone did not have the city to himself. On the north side of Chicago, a rival gang was running their own bootlegging operation. Their leader was a man named George Moran. Everyone called him Bugs. Moran and Capone hated each other. They had been trading attacks on each other's men for years. Moran had once ordered a drive-by shooting on the Hotel Cicero, where Capone was eating lunch. Over 1,000 bullets were fired at the building. Capone survived. He did not forget. By early 1929, Capone had decided he wanted Moran gone for good. He came up with a plan while he was on vacation at his house in Florida. The plan was brilliant, and it was ruthless. Someone acting on Capone's behalf reportedly made a phone call to Bugs Moran's North Side operation. The caller offered Moran a cheap shipment of high-quality whiskey that had supposedly been hijacked from a rival. Moran took the bait. He told the caller to bring the shipment to his headquarters the next morning. His headquarters was a commercial garage at 2122 North Clark Street in the Lincoln Park neighborhood. It was operated under a front business name called the SMC Cartage Company. This was where Moran's top men gathered. It was where the deliveries came in.
It was the heart of his operation. On the morning of February 14th, 1929, 7 men were waiting inside that garage. 6 of them were Moran's top gunmen. The 7th was a mechanic with loose ties to the gang. Their names were Peter Gusenberg, Frank Gusenberg, James Clark, Adam Heyer, Albert Weinshank, Reinhard Schwimmer, and John May. Schwimmer was actually an eye doctor who liked hanging around gangsters for the thrill of it. All 7 were dressed in their best suits. They were expecting a delivery, not a massacre. Around 10:30 in the morning, a black sedan pulled up in front of the garage. It looked exactly like the unmarked police cars the Chicago PD used at the time. 4 men got out. 2 of them were wearing full police uniforms. The other 2 were in regular clothes. To anyone watching from the street, it looked like a routine raid. Police raids on bootlegging operations happened constantly in Chicago during Prohibition. They were so common, the gangsters inside did not even panic when they heard the men coming through the door. The men in uniforms came in first. They ordered the 7 inside to put their hands up. They told them they were being arrested. The 7 men believed it. They handed over their weapons. They turned and faced the back wall of the garage with their hands against the bricks, just like anyone would do during a regular police raid. That is when the 2 men in plain clothes stepped forward, with Thompson's submachine guns. The 2 men in police uniforms pulled out a sawed-off shotgun, and they opened fire. 70 rounds were fired from the 2 Thompsons. 1 shell was discharged from the shotgun. The 7 men against the wall were cut down in seconds. 6 of them died instantly. One of them, Frank Gusenberg, somehow survived long enough to be found still breathing when the real police arrived. He had been hit 14 times. When officers asked him who had done this, Gusenberg followed the underworld code until his final breath. He said, "Nobody shot me." Bugs Moran, the actual target of the entire operation, was not in the garage. He had overslept that morning. As he walked toward the building at around the time the killing was happening, he saw men in police uniforms going inside. He assumed it was a real raid and kept walking. He never set foot near the garage that day. What likely saved him was a tragic mix-up. One of the men in his crew, Albert Weinshank, was roughly the same height as Moran and was wearing the same style of overcoat and hat. The lookouts watching for Moran apparently mistook Weinshank for the boss and signaled the hit team to move in. That mistake cost Weinshank his life and saved Moran's. Al Capone had an airtight alibi. He was hundreds of miles away in Florida when the killings happened. He was never formally charged, but when Moran was asked who did it, his answer was short: "Only Capone kills like that." When reporters called Capone for his response, he told them, "Only one man kills like that, Bugs Moran." The case was never officially solved, but the weapons used were later traced. In December 1929, one of Capone's top associates, named Fred Burke, was caught in Michigan after a traffic incident. When police searched his home, they found 2 Thompson submachine guns. Ballistics tests matched them to the bullets pulled out of the garage wall on North Clark Street. The St. Valentine's Day massacre shocked America. Newspapers across the country ran the crime scene photographs. The public demanded action. Within 2 years, Al Capone would be in federal prison on tax evasion charges. The era of untouchable Chicago bootleggers was ending. But the idea of a coordinated mass killing of rival mob members would be repeated again, and it would inspire one of the most famous scenes in film history. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis,
please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And more than 50 years later, a different kind of mass killing would take place on a Manhattan sidewalk. This time it would not be done with fake police uniforms or a Valentine's Day setup. This time, the target would walk directly into the trap during the busiest shopping season of the year, on a street filled with witnesses, in a hit so bold, it shocked even the men who had ordered it.
Section 7. The Castellano Assassination. The End of John Gotti's Patience. December 16, 1985. By the middle of the 1980s, the Gambino crime family was the most powerful organized crime group in the United States. It had more made members than any of the other New York families. It controlled more rackets. It earned more money. And at the top of that empire sat a quiet, reclusive man named Paul Castellano. Everyone called him Big Paul. Castellano was 70 years old in December of 1985. He had been running the Gambino family for 10 years, ever since his cousin and brother-in-law, Carlo Gambino, had passed away from a heart attack in 1976. Castellano was not a street guy. He was a businessman. He had turned the family away from the old-fashioned street rackets and into white-collar crime. Construction contracts, meat distribution, trucking companies, extortion deals that brought in millions without a single drop of blood being spilled. He lived in a 17-room mansion on Staten Island that he had designed to look like a miniature version of the White House. He rarely left it. His captains had to come to him. This quiet style made Castellano a lot of money, but it also made him a lot of enemies inside his own family. The younger and more aggressive members hated him. They thought he was weak. They thought he was soft. They thought he was out of touch with how the streets actually worked. And one of the loudest voices in that group of dissatisfied men was a Queens captain named John Gotti. John Gotti was 45 years old. He was charming, photogenic, and ambitious. He wore tailored suits and combed his hair perfectly and loved talking to the press. He was also dealing heroin, which Castellano had strictly forbidden. Castellano had a rule. Any member of the family caught dealing narcotics would be eliminated. He knew the FBI went after drug cases harder than any other type of crime, and he did not want that kind of heat on his organization. In 1983, Gotti's brother Gene Gotti and a close associate named Angelo Ruggiero were arrested on heroin trafficking charges. The FBI had been recording conversations inside Ruggiero's house for months, and the tapes were full of evidence. When Castellano found out about the tapes, he demanded copies of them. He wanted to hear exactly what had been said, because if his own name or the family's business was on those tapes, it could destroy everything he had built. Gotti and Ruggiero refused to hand them over. The situation became a standoff. Castellano started hinting that he was going to break up Gotti's crew. That was all Gotti needed to hear. If Castellano moved first, Gotti and everyone loyal to him would be dead or out of the family within weeks. Gotti decided to strike first. The man who made it possible was a senior Gambino captain named Frank DeCicco. DeCicco was officially loyal to Castellano, but he had quietly sided with Gotti. On the morning of December 16, 1985, DeCicco told Gotti that Castellano was going to be attending a dinner meeting that evening at a restaurant called Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street, just off 3rd Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. The meeting would be held around 5 in the evening. Castellano would be arriving in a car driven by his underboss and personal bodyguard, a loyal man named Thomas Bellotti. This was the moment Gotti had been waiting for. Midtown Manhattan during Christmas shopping season was the last place in New York anyone would expect a mob boss to be taken out. The streets would be packed with holiday shoppers. That was exactly why Gotti chose to do it there. Nobody would be looking. The hit team was organized with military precision. 4 shooters were dressed identically in long white trench coats and Russian-style black fur hats. The uniform served 2 purposes. First, it made them blend in with other people on the crowded street.
Second, it gave witnesses something to focus on other than their faces. The 4 shooters were Salvatore Scala, Vincent Artuso, Edward Lino, and John Carneglia. Backup shooters were positioned farther down the street in case anything went wrong. John Gotti himself, along with his right-hand man Salvatore Gravano, who was known as Sammy the Bull, was parked across the street in a Lincoln sedan with tinted windows. They had a clear view of the front of Sparks, and they were in radio contact with the hit team using walkie-talkies. At 5:16 in the evening, a black Lincoln carrying Castellano and Bellotti pulled up to the front of the restaurant. Bellotti was driving. Castellano was in the passenger seat. As Castellano opened his door and stepped out, the 4 trench-coated shooters walked up and opened fire. Castellano was hit 6 times. He collapsed to the ground next to the car before he could even fully stand up. Bellotti tried to react from the driver's side, but 2 more shooters came at him from behind. He was struck 4 times and fell dead in the street. The whole thing took less than 30 seconds. The shooters walked calmly away through the crowd and disappeared into the side streets. Gotti, watching from his Lincoln, gave the order to drive past the bodies 1 time to confirm both men were dead. Then he and Gravano turned south and headed back to Brooklyn. 2 weeks later, John Gotti was voted the new boss of the Gambino crime family. For nearly 7 years, federal prosecutors tried and failed to convict Gotti of anything major. The press started calling him the Teflon Don because no charge seemed to stick to him. But on April 2nd, 1992, thanks largely to Sammy the Bull agreeing to cooperate with the FBI, Gotti was finally convicted of 13 counts, including ordering the killing of Paul Castellano. He was sentenced to life without parole. He died of throat cancer in a federal prison in Missouri in June of 2002. No one else was ever charged for the killings of Castellano and Bellotti outside Sparks' Steakhouse. 6 years before that hit, another brazen restaurant killing had stunned New York. It happened in broad daylight on a hot summer afternoon in Brooklyn, and the victim was a man so cocky he had once said out loud that nobody would ever dare to touch him.
Section 8. The Cigar Still Burning. Carmine Galante. July 12, 1979. Some mob bosses died because they were too cautious. Some mob bosses died because they made enemies of the wrong people. Carmine Galante died because he looked around at the most powerful men in the American underworld and said out loud that he was better than all of them combined. Galante was 69 years old in the summer of 1979. He had been born in East Harlem in 1910 to parents who had emigrated from the Sicilian town of Castellammare del Golfo. From the time he was a young boy, he was a problem. He was sent to reform school at age 10. He dropped out of 7th grade at 15. He was sentenced to prison for assault before he turned 17. And by the time he was in his 20s, he was already carrying out hits for some of the most dangerous men in New York. Law enforcement eventually connected him to somewhere between 80 and 100 killings over the course of his career. In 1931, he was sent to prison again for shooting a police officer and a 6-year-old bystander during a failed truck robbery. Both of them survived. By the 1950s, Galante had become a top earner for the Bonanno crime family, one of the 5 families of New York. He ran an international heroin smuggling operation in partnership with Joe Bonanno himself. He attended the famous Appalachian meeting in 1957, a secret gathering of mob bosses in upstate New York that was accidentally broken up by a local state trooper, an event that embarrassed the Mafia and put the whole organization on the FBI's radar for the first time. In 1962, Galante was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for drug trafficking. He served 12 years and was released on parole in 1974. When he came out, he decided he was not going to be just another captain. He was going to run the whole Bonanno family. And not just that. He was going to declare himself the most powerful mob boss in America. Galante's nickname was the Cigar. He got the name because he was almost never seen without a thick cigar hanging from his mouth. He also went by the name Lillo, which is Italian slang for a short, fat cigar. He was only 5 feet 5 inches tall, but he was feared for his cruelty and his complete lack of fear. He muscled other bosses out of the heroin business. He took over street corners that did not belong to him. He kept telling people that he was the new boss of bosses. And he did all of this without asking permission from the Commission, the governing body that Lucky Luciano had set up back in 1931 to prevent exactly this kind of power grab. By 1979, the heads of the other major New York families had heard enough. The Commission made an official decision. Carmine Galante had to go. The order came down. The job was handed to a Bonanno faction led by Philip Rastelli, the man the Commission wanted to take over the family after Galante was out of the way. Rastelli worked through 2 of his top captains, a man named Dominic Napolitano, who was known as Sonny Black, and a man named Alphonse Indelicato, who was known as Sonny Red. They made a deal with Galante's own inner circle. His 2 personal bodyguards were a pair of Sicilian imports known as the Zips. Their names were Cesare Bonventre and Baldo Amato. The Commission offered them promotions and a bigger share of the heroin business if they would stand aside when the hit happened. Both men agreed immediately. They did not just agree to step aside. They agreed to help set up their own boss. The afternoon of July 12, 1979, was sweltering in New York. The temperature hit 87 degrees. Galante decided to have lunch with a few close men at a small restaurant called Joe and Mary's Italian-American Restaurant at 205 Knickerbocker Avenue in the Bushwick neighborhood of Brooklyn. The restaurant was owned by Galante's own cousin, Giuseppe Turano. Turano was planning to fly to Sicily for a vacation in the coming days, and Galante had come by to say goodbye. Also at the table was a Bonanno associate and drug dealer named Leonardo Coppola. Galante's 2 bodyguards, Bonventre and Amato, took seats at the same table. Galante asked to eat out on the private back patio, an open-air dining area tucked behind the restaurant. The group ate fish and salad and drank wine. When the meal was finished, Galante lit up one of his signature cigars. He was once famously quoted as saying, "Nobody would ever touch him because they would not dare." At around 2:45 in the afternoon, 3 men in ski masks walked into the front of the restaurant. They were carrying shotguns and handguns. They moved straight through the dining area toward the back patio. One of them was later identified as Anthony Indelicato, the son of Sonny Red. Bonventre and Amato, the 2 bodyguards, stood up and moved out of the way. They did not reach for their weapons. They did not shout a warning. They simply let the shooters pass. The hit lasted only a few seconds. Galante, Coppola, and Turano were all killed on the patio. The shooters turned and walked back out of the restaurant the same way they had come in, and they vanished into the streets of Brooklyn. Bonventre and Amato were completely unharmed. When the press arrived at the scene, they took one photograph that would travel around the world. Carmine Galante was lying flat on his back on the concrete of the patio, next to an overturned table. His eyes were closed. The cigar he had lit minutes earlier was still clenched between his teeth. It was the image that defined an era of the Mafia. When the coroner took his body out of the restaurant on a stretcher, the stretcher passed directly under a sign above the door. The sign advertised takeout service. It read, "We give special attention to outgoing orders." That photograph also ran in the newspapers the next morning. The Catholic Archdiocese of New York refused to give Galante a funeral mass. They said the scandal would be too great. It was one of the rare times in modern American history that the Catholic Church publicly refused a mob boss a church burial.
Of everyone involved in organizing the hit, only Anthony Indelicato was ever brought to trial and convicted. He served 13 years.
Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Galante had broken the rules of the commission because he thought he was untouchable. 7 years before that, another mobster had broken a different kind of rule, the unwritten agreement that Little Italy was sacred ground where bloodshed was not allowed. He broke that rule on the worst possible night to be out in public, celebrating a birthday that would turn out to be his last. Section 9. Crazy Joe Gallo's last birthday, April 7th, 1972. There are mob hits that happen because someone broke a rule. And then there are mob hits that happen because someone was simply too reckless, too loud, and too famous to stay alive. Joe Gallo was the second kind. He was a walking headline. The newspapers loved him. The police watched him constantly. Other mobsters thought he was out of control. And on the night of his 43rd birthday, all of those things caught up to him at the same time. Joe Gallo was born in the Red Hook section of Brooklyn in 1929. His nickname was Crazy Joe, and it was not a joke. He had been diagnosed with a mental health condition as a young man, and his behavior in the street reflected it. He was unpredictable. He was violent. He was obsessed with old gangster movies and sometimes imitated the way actors like James Cagney and Richard Widmark spoke. He was a member of what was then called the Profaci crime family, which later became the Colombo family. He had a reputation for taking contracts that other mobsters refused. He was widely suspected to have been one of the actual shooters in the Albert Anastasia barbershop hit back in 1957, though he was never charged. In the 1960s, Gallo and his brothers Larry and Albert led a full-scale war inside their own family. They kidnapped the underboss and several top captains, demanding a better financial deal. They eventually lost, and Gallo spent most of the decade in prison on extortion charges. When he came out in 1971, he was a different kind of mobster. He had spent years reading books in his cell. He had become friendly with black inmates, which was unheard of in the traditional Italian mafia. He started showing up at fashionable parties in Manhattan. He became friends with actors and writers and journalists. Jerry Orbach, the famous actor who would later star in Law & Order, actually became one of his close personal friends. But the men running the Colombo family did not see a changed man. They saw a loose cannon who had made their organization look weak, and they blamed him for something very specific. On June 28, 1971, the boss of the Colombo family, Joe Colombo, had been shot 3 times during a public rally at Columbus Circle. He survived but was left paralyzed. The shooter was killed at the scene. Colombo family leadership became convinced that Gallo had been behind the attack. Police eventually concluded the shooter had acted alone, but inside the underworld, the decision had already been made. On the night of April 6, 1972, Gallo celebrated his birthday at the Copacabana, the famous Manhattan nightclub. He watched the comedian Don Rickles perform. He invited Rickles to join his group for a late dinner afterward. Rickles politely declined. Gallo's party that night was small. It included his new wife Sina, her young daughter Lisa, his sister Carmela, and his bodyguard Peter Diopoulos, who was known as Pete the Greek. Around 4:30 in the morning on April 7th, which was now officially Gallo's 43rd birthday, the group walked into a small restaurant called Umberto's Clam House at 129 Mulberry Street in Little Italy. The restaurant had only been open for 2 months. Little Italy was considered off-limits to underworld attacks by unwritten tradition. Gallo felt safe there. He should not have. A Colombo associate named Joseph Luparelli was drinking at the bar when the Gallo party sat down. Luparelli recognized Gallo instantly. He quietly left the restaurant, walked to a nearby mob hangout, and rounded up 4 gunmen. Within minutes, they were walking back into Umberto's with weapons drawn. The shooters opened fire on the table. Gallo reacted fast. He flipped the heavy butcher block table onto its side to shield his family, and pulled out his own handgun. He was hit 5 times. 20 rounds were fired in total. Despite his injuries, Gallo managed to stagger out onto the sidewalk, likely trying to draw the gunfire away from his family. He collapsed on Mulberry Street and was pronounced deceased shortly after at a hospital. At his funeral 3 days later, his sister Carmela shouted a warning to the crowd. She said the streets were going to run red. The hit on Joe Gallo was never officially solved. The New York underworld had always settled its disputes within its own borders, but the Italian Mafia had another home across the Atlantic, and in 1992, the Sicilian branch would declare an all-out war not on another family, but on the Italian government itself, in an attack so massive it registered on earthquake monitors.
Section 10. When the Mafia declared war on the state. The Capaci bombing, May 23, 1992. Every mob killing you have heard about so far in this video happened on one side of the Atlantic Ocean. American cities, American streets, American restaurants. But the Mafia was not born in America. It was born in Sicily, the large island off the southern tip of Italy. The Sicilian Mafia, also called Cosa Nostra, had been operating there for more than 100 years before the New York Five families ever existed. And in the spring of 1992, the Sicilian branch carried out an attack so massive, so coordinated, and so bold that it made every American mob hit look small by comparison. The target was a 53-year-old judge named Giovanni Falcone. Falcone was the most famous anti-mafia prosecutor in the world. For years, he had been building cases against the Sicilian Mafia using a method nobody had tried before. He was following the money. He was tracing bank accounts.
He was interviewing informants who had flipped on the organization. And in 1986 and 1987, he had pulled off something nobody thought was possible. It was called the Maxi trial. Falcone and his partner, another judge named Paolo Borsellino, put 475 Mafia members on trial at the same time inside a specially built underground courtroom. The trial resulted in 338 convictions and 19 life sentences. It was the biggest legal blow the Italian Mafia had ever taken. The leader of the Sicilian Mafia at the time was a man named Salvatore Riina. Everyone called him Toto. He was the boss of a faction called the Corleonesi, named after the Sicilian town they came from. Yes, that is the same town that Mario Puzo named the Corleone family after in The Godfather. The real Corleonesi were not fictional. They were the most ruthless faction in the history of the Sicilian Mafia. Riina had personally ordered more than 150 killings. In January of 1992, the highest court in Italy upheld all of the convictions from the Maxi trial. Riina held a meeting with his top men and made a decision. Judge Falcone had to be taken out, and the killing had to be so big that the Italian government would never dare to come after them again. The job was given to a mafia hitman named Giovanni Brusca. His nickname was the Pig. Brusca and his men spent weeks planning the attack. They chose a specific stretch of highway called the A29, which connected Palermo International Airport to the city of Palermo. Falcone flew to Rome for work during the week and flew back to Palermo almost every weekend. He always used this same road. The crew loaded 13 metal drums with 500 kilograms of high-grade explosives. That is more than 1,100 pounds. They used a skateboard to slide the drums into a drainage tunnel that ran directly underneath the highway. Then they waited. On May 23, 1992, Judge Falcone landed at Palermo Airport. His wife, Francesca Morvillo, who was also a judge, was with him. 3 police officers were assigned to protect them. Their names were Vito Schifani, Rocco Di Cio, and Antonio Montinaro. 3 armored cars left the airport together. Falcone and his wife were in the middle car. Falcone was driving it himself. Giovanni Brusca was watching from a small hut on a hillside overlooking the highway. When the convoy reached the right stretch of road, at exactly 5:56 in the evening, he pressed the button on a remote-controlled detonator. The explosion was so massive that it was picked up by seismic monitoring stations located on the other side of the island, where scientists had been tracking volcanic activity at Mount Etna. The road itself was torn apart. The blast killed Judge Falcone, his wife Francesca, and all 3 of the police officers in the lead car. Toto Riina was reportedly told about the killing later that same night, and according to former Mafia members who later cooperated with investigators, he raised a glass of champagne in celebration. The Capaci bombing broke the Italian public. Thousands of people flooded the streets of Palermo for the funerals. Within 57 days, Judge Paolo Borsellino, Falcone's closest colleague, was also assassinated. But the Mafia's plan backfired. The Italian government responded with the largest anti-Mafia crackdown in history. Toto Riina was captured on January 15, 1993, and spent the rest of his life in prison. He died there in 2017. Giovanni Brusca was captured in 1996 and eventually cooperated with authorities, helping dismantle the Corleonesi from the inside. The Godfather showed the world what organized crime could look like at its most dramatic. But the real men the films were based on wrote stories that were louder, bloodier, and more final than any screenwriter would ever dare to put on screen. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.